Hello, my name is Riley Hupping, and today I'll be doing my presentation on forensic anthropology, specifically gunshot wounds and their impact. As a little overview, forensic anthropology is a specialized subfield of biological anthropology with a focus on the analysis of human skeletal remains within a medical legal context. Some overview for gunshot wounds. Gunshot wounds are defined as trauma the body experiences when a bullet enters the body as a projectile and damages the human body. Within the medical legal context of forensics, gunshot wounds fall under ballistics, and they are considered high velocity weapons, but within ballistics there are low, medium, and high velocity guns. Just a bit of distinction there. In forensic anthropology, we can determine the direction of a bullet wound on a skeleton, and we can look at certain aspects like beveling, the size of the entry and exit wounds, if there is an exit wound, and the distinction of the fractures and the damage that the bone has, the damage of the bone in the human body caused by the gunshot wound to determine our analysis of this human skeleton. Furthermore, though, forensic anthropology can't be used to note everything that has to do with the wound. It can note placement if there is distinct marks on the bone, but it can't be used to determine the sequence of the shots that were fired. It can't be used to determine the number of the shots that were fired into the body. It can't be used to determine it also can't, without supporting soft tissue, you can't always tell the exact type of caliber or entrance or exit wound of the human body, because forensic anthropology only looks at bones, of course. Why did I choose from this gunshot wound? Well, that's because I really am interested in forensic anthropology, and I'm interested in how gunshot wounds interact with the biological components of the human skeleton, so I just thought I would share with all of you. Specifically today, we're going to be looking at a couple of facets of gunshot wounds as they affect the biological anthropology. Specifically, we're going to be looking at beveling, which is the impact of the distortion of the bone around the entrance or the exit wounds. We're going to be looking at the size of the entry wound. We are not going to be looking at the size of the exit wound, and I'll explain a little bit later why. We're going to be looking at the different types of fractures or the type of bone displacement that we can be seen in different types of calibers as they affect the wound. And we're going to be looking at the size of the exit wound relative to each of the calibers that I'm demonstrating today. We're not looking at the size of the exit wounds quantitatively, only qualitatively, because there's not always an exit wound to quantitatively measure. It really does depend on the impact and the force and the speed of the projectile. So we're just leaving that out for this sake of discussion. First today, we're going to be looking at the 9mm pistol. 9mm pistols, you have beveling. Typically, you have outer table beveling, which can be seen in this picture here below me in the bottom. And you can have some inner table beveling, which would be beveling on the entrance wound, but it is not super common. It is more common on the exit wound on the outside of the skull. The typical size of the entrance wound is about approximately 1.5 inches long by 5/8 inches wide. It's typically pretty similar to the dimensions of the bullet. Typical fractures, it would be the typical keyhole fracture. So it's basically what I'm showing here in this picture here. It looks like a little keyhole. It's just boop in. Pretty simple. And the size of the exit wound relative to the other ones that we're discussing today, which would be a 22 long rifle and a 12 gauge shotgun, it would typically have a small wound relative to the other two, as it is one of the smaller calibers, and it comes from a handgun, which tends to be smaller as well. Next up is the 12 gauge shotgun, and I know what you're thinking. Doesn't that leave a pretty big entrance wound? And you would be correct. Yes, it does. Size of entry ranges from 3/4 of an inch to 1 3/4 of an inch, which is pretty large. Of course, it all depends. There are tons of different variable factors when it comes to entrance and exit wounds, such as the speed and the distance of the projectile. But this is a typical range for a 12 gauge shotgun. We do see some internal and external beveling. Both are fairly common, typically because we have a lot of exit wounds with a shotgun because it is a very powerful projectile. Not uncommon to find obliteration of some of the skeleton when it comes to shotguns. Like I said, very, very powerful weapon. Has a lot of force behind it. It has a lot of speed. And it's a large projectile because it's a large caliber. There can be some fragmentary pieces of bone, and there can be other satellite wounds throughout it because as it is shot, parts of it disseminate and it becomes like separate projectiles. So it's not uncommon to find those in surrounding areas of the bones and have those also have those little satellite particles also displace bone. It is a very large exit wound, as you can see in the skeleton behind me. Those two giant holes. Yeah, that's an entrance and exit wound. Quite large. Moving on, 22 long rifle. Definitely a more powerful weapon, usually used in hunting. Not as powerful as the shotgun, of course. Mostly external beveling. It does tend to leave more exit wounds than not. There is some possible internal. There's a little bit of, we're not quite sure about that. Typical size of the entry wound is about 5 to 6 millimeters. Can cause some fragmentary pieces, mostly concentric fractures, as very commonly seen for this rifle. And it is about an intermediate exit wound compared to the others. Now, this data is a little disputed because there's just not a whole lot of data to be done, and there's not a whole lot of there's a lot more experiments that could be done, so the data is a little limited for these. And then some takeaways are, as caliber increase, entry and exit wound increase. There's lots of things that can be inferred from forensic anthropology being applied, but there are, of course, always limitations whenever you don't have soft tissue support it. And that is about all that I have. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned a lot about forensic anthropology and how gunshot wounds are affected. Thank you.